Ruth. As I said earlier, as we read through Psalm 105, it's an entire story of the people of Israel, and it goes throughout a long portion of their history. There's something powerful about stories, but I want you to think really quickly about what someone would know about your story if they only got a record of actions that you took. Not what you were thinking about, not the reasons why, but just what you have done, where you've gone or not gone. What would somebody understand about who you were? What would somebody understand about your story if they only met you once and they saw one little portion of who you are? How would they know who you are, your story, the completeness and the complexity of where you've come from, where you're going, and what you've learned? There's a Nigerian writer named Chimamanda Adichie who gave a TED Talk years ago about the danger of a single story. She talks about how when we hear only one story, one perspective on a story, if we begin to believe that that is the whole story, we lose perspective on more than just that story or that person, but on everything we begin to understand. I bring this up because the story of Jacob is one that many Christians know, that is a story about a man whose flaws are evident almost from the very beginning. And yet Jacob is blessed by God and continues the story of God's promise and covenant with Abraham. Jacob was born a twin, the second twin with his brother Esau, to Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac was Abraham's and Sarah's only son. Jacob, from the very beginning, was very unlike his father. His father knew and understood the kind of man that Esau would become, but Jacob was more of a quandary. Jacob was cunning and clever. He tricked his brother out of his birthright for a bit of stew. He got all of the property and blessings because he made his brother agree to give them up because one day he was hungry. And later, when his father was dying, Jacob pretended to be his brother and stole a blessing to the firstborn that was rightfully Esau's. He ran away for fear of his life and the wrath of his brother into his uncle Laban's family. His uncle Laban, too, was sort of tricky. Jacob wanted to marry Rachel, but instead married Leah first. The damage done by the marriages to Leah and Rachel, to those women and to their legacies, is a story for another day, but an example of the complexity of relationships and understandings that stories are not one-sided. Jacob, in his work with Laban, becomes rich. The blessing of the firstborn, his work and his diligence in his life begin to bear fruit with a large family and even larger holdings. Eventually, Jacob decides he wants to return home. On his way home, he prepares to meet his brother Esau, and this is where we find him. He has separated his belongings, his flocks, his family, so that in the event that his brother comes wanting blood, hopefully not all will be lost. But Jacob, leaving everyone else behind, goes away to be alone. And throughout the night, we hear that he struggles with God. This man comes into his place, and they wrestle and struggle all night long, seeking something. At the break of day, the man says to Jacob, "Let me go." But Jacob refuses until he is given a blessing. And so, as Jacob continues to struggle, this man hits him on the hip socket. And he's hurt, but he still holds on and claims a blessing from God. He names this place Peniel, a place where I have seen God face to face and persevered. But he does not leave this place unchanged, for the blessing comes with the change of a name from Jacob to Israel, and with a limp, a mark of his struggle with God. I tell you this story because in the context of who Jacob is, it is important for us to note that his life is a testament to God's decision to use all of us, to use the completeness of our stories to transform human beings through our lives into kingdom dwellers and proclaimers of God's love in the world. As Christians, we look at this story as an example of how God is actively at work in the lives of people. How the promises of God keep coming back even when we do things to diminish the stories we tell. As I thought about Jacob, I thought about the gift that this story is, because in so many ways, we only read about and understand people's stories from the outside. We hear about what they did, what decisions they made, and the effects of those decisions on other people. But rarely do we see or hear anything about the internal struggle of people who are seeking to understand God's call on their lives and what it means to see all of your story and to still strive to live into God's intention in the future. It is difficult to share that part of our stories. I'm sure all of us know that when we begin to talk about an experience of transformation in our lives, words just don't seem to cut it. How do you explain that feeling in your gut that something is just right? How do you show other people something that you know because of the 5 little nudges that you have had that have brought you to a place of understanding, a next step, or a deeper dive into what you are becoming and who you are becoming? Relationships are complicated by their very nature. They bring together 2 people. But in the midst of that relationship, something else is put together that cannot be separated again. It's an amazing gift that our stories intertwine and become something altogether different. But we often need to step back and to reflect on what it is that our story is and how it is that God is inviting us into a new story. Maybe the new story is how we tell about the story we have come from. Maybe the new story is about changing some of the actions that we take. Because as we learn about our old story, we see things about it that do not fit with our image of God or with the invitation of who God is calling us to be. The interior struggle of faithful people can never be told in a story in completeness, but it can be shared as we experience each other. When we open ourselves and honestly share where and how we are learning to be different to be aware of God's movement in the world and to recognize the other stories that maybe have always been before us, that we have done harm by only knowing one perspective. Jacob's story is so immense, so complex, filled with intrigue and interesting relationships, that it sometimes is easy for us to forget the places where Jacob's story did harm. After this particular encounter with God, Jacob meets with his brother Esau. And it is Esau, not Jacob, who demonstrates God's grace and generosity. For it is Esau who was harmed. And Jacob, in his own transformed state, is able to enter into that relationship in a new way. I wonder if it is because he has wrestled with God. Because he has seen in his history the ways that his behavior, that his life does not embody the promise that God will be a blessing through him. And in the struggle with God, Jacob is changed, marked physically by a limp and marked in his name to be a bearer of God's promise. And that promise comes with the renewing of relationships that once were severed. When we look around the world, there are lots of opportunities to see how and where relationships have been broken, where harm has been done by us or the church, or simply in places where harm has been done because the stories we hear were incomplete. I wonder if the invitation for us isn't to say, what do we do? But how do we learn? How do we share the stories of our lives? And how do we recognize that the stories of others will have the same complexity, the same intrigue, the same understanding that we have for stories we know so well? If you had to tell your story to another person, what would be important about who you are? What stories would you share, and which stories would you not? Why would you make those choices? When we think about our own stories, I think we have a lot more grace, or at least I do, grace and forgiveness about the places where I have messed up. And even the places where I have succeeded. We temper our stories so that people can hear them. But on the other side, what kind of people are we when we listen to other stories? Do we listen to other people and the stories they tell about who they are, openly and with acceptance of what they tell us? Or do we question it against a single story that we may know that refutes it? How in the world can we come to understand who God is if we aren't able to listen to and to learn from the stories of others? I think the invitation for us is to hold on not only to who we are, but to the promise that God can continue to work in us, to change us and embrace us, to rename us and send us forth into the future, to live in different ways. Not to deny the story of the past, but to create the story of the future. In Jacob, I find hope because God was able, through the many places in Jacob's life where he made mistakes, where his story intersected with others in ways that may not have been what God intended. but which did in the end bring to the world the promise and the blessing to Israel, and the blessing and promise of Jesus Christ, whose incarnation brought us into the story, whose grace continues to keep us here, and whose love is what enables us to live this embodied relationship with God every day. God has provided what we need to tell our stories and to ask questions of our stories, and even to change them whenever God's transforming invitation comes to us. How can we listen and attend to our stories and move into the future, not dictated upon where we have been, but upon the one who goes before us and is creating a world unlike any we have ever seen? Our stories shape who we are and shape the world around us. May we attend to the promises of God and keep telling our stories and listening for the stories of others, that we may be changed and transformed as we see beyond the single story and understand God's embracing story for all of humanity in the world. Amen.